So initially I thought about what to talk about, and sort of as a follow-up to what Kathy had presented the last time. And I thought that talking about weaving and intention, and specifically around intentional weaving, was going to be, I don't know, an interesting conversation to have. Get to hear what other network weavers are doing out there in terms of how they, purposely and deliberately weave their networks, but also sort of share knowledge around what that would look like, covering the whole spectrum of weaving. Yeah, so that's the reason why we have intentional weaving, right? Yeah, so I was hoping that perhaps we would, sort of have a discussion around what network weaving is. And sometimes we have, it sounds very technical, yeah. When you hear the word weaving, it sounds like there's some mechanics that sort of goes in and out, but which is, I mean, in a sense, true. Yeah, but I wanted to hear what your thoughts are. I'm not sure where I would start, because we have, I don't know, I think we have a whole spectrum of what's the word? People at different levels of the process, right? So it would be just nice to sort of hear what your thoughts are around network weaving. What comes to your mind when you hear? And I know now, as the practice sort of, the practice of network weaving, I think, is gaining traction over time, especially around when we're thinking about systems change and all that. So I'm curious to know what your, what comes to mind when you hear network weaving. I don't know who wants to go. And perhaps one word, 2 words, it doesn't have to be a whole definition or sentence. I don't know. What pops up? Yeah.
I'm going to say something rather than typing in chat is hard for me. I'm on my iPad. Yeah. To me, network weaving is creating interconnections of people and organizations. And I think in a way, because as you know, from the last session, I tend to split out building community from creating networks, and network weaving sort of, to me, is about sort of making networks available to each other in a sense, as opposed to building community where you're creating that shared interest and bond and so on, where you expect people to sort of gather and have maybe some sort of purpose or shared activity later. Network weaving, to me, is a bit more about creating connections, and the opportunity of connecting in the future, as opposed to necessarily bringing together people for a shared purpose.
Thank you. That is so spot on, Kathy. Thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts around that, Mahira? Perhaps.
I'm very new to the concept, but the way that I've understood it till now is kind of maybe I think bringing together different parts of the network in maybe ways that it would not have been connected previously.
Okay. Yeah, that's another way of looking at it for sure. Ben, Kamini, do you want to share your thoughts as well? It's a small quorum. I think everyone is going to get a chance today to sort of.
Yeah, I wrote something in chat actually. I mean, it's very much along the lines of Kathy.
Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, that's okay. What Kathy was saying, for me, it's about connecting. It's about connecting. Different parts, as Mahira sort of articulately put it. Together with that shared purpose, that shared objective, etc. And how to kind of bring about an inclusive, socially cohesive kind of network.
That's great. Yeah, that's ties very well with both Kathy's and Mahira's definition of it. So I think we're on the same page. Ben, do you have anything to share on it?
Those all sound like excellent points. I think it feels covered.
All right, cool. Yeah, no, I think all your definitions or understanding of it really is this spot on, right? And I know most of us know June Holly. I know she's one of the people behind the term, network weaving. She did a very interesting definition around it, and I do consume very good number of her resources. And so one of the things I found interesting is how she defined it around, I think, again, ties very well with what we've all sort of put out. And she talks about network weaving as the, consciousness of the relationships that surround our network or surround us, and the intentional seeking out to deepen and making networks more inclusive, right? And of course, this involves the process around, connecting people strategically within the network and enabling them to collaborate meaningfully. And I want to underline a couple of words, and I think Kathy sort of alluded to it, like just beyond bringing people together or, sort of people coming together on shared purpose, I would want to underline some words like around intentional, the consciousness around the relationships, like understanding exactly who you have within the network, right? But also beyond that, looking at meaningful collaborations. There's so many, and this is really the purpose of this conversation, is that I see so many networks sort of coming up. I mean, I see different groups coming together to form a network, but not necessarily going the extra mile around being very conscious, mapping out exactly what or who is in the network, and creating meaningful pathways where the organizations, the members, can meaningfully collaborate and work together and deepen the relationships, strengthen whatever is going on. So that's usually very key around networks. And weaving is the backbone of any, I would say, of any successful network, because that is where change, I would say that's where change actually happens, because you're able to put together people whose interests are, people with common interests around, communities, around, working groups, so that they're able to actually collaborate, meaningfully create something out of it, right? And so I think of networks as, I would say, I think of networks as living systems, right? So, and the reason why it's very useful to think of networks as living systems is that one of the most important insights of the systemic understanding of life is the recognition that networks are the basic pattern of organization of every living thing. So this implies that a network is common to all life, and whatever we see life, you are able to see a network. And think of nature, think of our systems, our body systems. Think of whatever is living, whenever you think about a living system, you would in a sense think about a network. So at the very heart of change, of paradigm, from a very mechanistic point of view to a more systemic view, and I know there's the whole conversation right now around systemic change, and so the whole paradigm shift to systemic viewing of things is really the metaphor around seeing the world as a machine to understanding. That's how you actually get to understand how the world works, right? And of course, networks continually create or recreate themselves, and they transform or replace their components during that process. And in this way, they undergo continual structure.
We've lost Donita. Donita? It's frozen.
I'll message her, one sec.
Changes while preserving their components. Stability and change is really one of the key characters as living things. Yeah.
Donita, we lost you for a minute there, about 30 seconds back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, my internet is rather shaky. Is this better now?
Yes.
I don't know why I lost you guys, but I was trying to sort of expound on networks as living systems. So also saying that networks, of course, create and continue recreating themselves by transforming or replacing their components. And through this process, they undergo continual structural changes. And I think, I know we've seen this, we've seen this in networks so many times, you know, creating and recreating their shared intentions or shared purpose, but also while preserving their patterns of organizations. It's still a network that sort of changes or recreates itself to fit for purpose, I would say. So this coexistence of stability and change is really the key. It is a key characteristic of life, and that's why we think of networks as living systems. And this is this really ties well with the next section. Sorry. Of the network as a garden, right? And I'm curious to know if any of us are familiar with a garden analogy. The garden analogy, I don't know, around living things, around now. All right.
No, but yesterday became
okay,
familiar
except
with it.
Kamini and Paul. Does Kathy and Mahira sort of? Okay. Yeah, so it's really it's a very interesting analogy, right? And paints a very interesting parallel between a garden and a network. And from the previous section, I know there's you can already start seeing how there is a connection between a living system, a garden, which is also a living system, and a network and how they work. So, and like mechanized system, and I alluded to this earlier, which are built on very specific specifications, or rather on exact specifications, right? Gardens cannot be forced to grow in any certain way, you know, despite meeting the same conditions. You would have two gardens, same place, you're planting the same thing, but the result of it you're not able to get the same thing despite having the same conditions. Again, because this is it's an organic system. And this is because there is always, or rather every plant grows in relationship to the environment that it's built on. And this, this could be around the soil, right? It could be around the climate. It could be around the neighborhood that the garden is sort of being, has been set up. And you would know that, despite the best condition, it's not possible for the garden to grow overnight. And there's usually a time, that's the whole process of planting. You meet the conditions, but also that despite meeting that, there's always I don't know how they call the planting period, but between planting and harvesting, it takes time, regardless of, there's nothing that grows overnight. So it takes time. That's the whole point I'm trying to make. And no matter how much attention you give to it, it's not possible to do it overnight. It's not possible to do it within a month if the germination timeline is 3 months or something. So it's not possible to do that. And despite providing the right nutrients, despite providing enough sunlight, despite providing all conditions that are required for the plant to grow, it's not possible to do that overnight. So to be able to do that, to be able to have a fully functional garden, you have to be able to meet other conditions just despite the basics. You have to provide pollinators, you have to use fertilizers, you have to pull weeds, you have to adopt your focus to attend to whatever the garden needs most. In some instances, like for example, if you're doing tomatoes, you have to provide structures to support the various forms and shapes that the plant needs to grow. So those are some of the conditions that a plant requires, to grow. And that is why precisely we think about, when we think about networks, we think about cultivating or nurturing as opposed to building, right? And meaning that you can create the right conditions for something to emerge and flourish, but you have to cultivate the land so that the crops can be able to grow. There's a whole process that goes into it. And rather than building a structure, you are thinking about, you're thinking about enabling, providing an enabling environment, which is not necessarily a brick to brick predetermined blueprint. And that's in essence what building a network is. You can be able to, once you provide the right, conditions to it, once you do the right cultivations, you're doing the right, you've provided enough cross-pollinators, you've provided enough structures to support the plants, and given, sort of give it time for the plants to grow. You can, you can be able to get an outcome out of it, and that's the parallel that we are drawing today between a garden and a network. But I wanted to take a pause and perhaps reflect on the network as a garden, and sort of check if this resonates with you. If you have any experiences with, some of the things that I've talked about, what sort of stuck out from that. Yeah.
It seems to me one of the interesting parts about this as an analogy is that, every seed is different, as you were saying in the beginning, right? The fact that, it's organic and every seed is different. Conditions are always a little bit different, whether it's the sunlight or the weather, the soil, whatever it might be. Even two things planted nearby are going to be slightly different. And I think the fact that, a network, it can be a network of organizations, but mostly we think of networks as people, and the group that you're bringing together or connecting, everybody's different, and therefore it's going to develop, grow, evolve, and just going to be different because of that as well. So in some ways, I think there are a lot of good points. The amount of time it takes, obviously, and that it goes on sort of in an open-ended kind of way. But to me, and it needs tending as opposed to building. But I do think this sort of the uniqueness and the organic nature of it, which is actually what makes it interesting, right? And makes working in networks interesting as a facilitator or network expert, right? It's not like it's the same every time. There's always people involved that make it interesting and different.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kathy. That's so true. I really like how you're able to, sort of piece that together. I don't know if Mahira has something to share. Anything that sort of rang a bell. It doesn't have to be. Yeah.
I think something that I thought was interesting was like, if you talk about, say, building structures or like building in general, you're usually dealing with objects that can be made exactly the same. But when you think of the network as a garden, you realize that that the thing in itself will also shape it. So it's not just what you do, but a lot of different factors that will, I think, influence it. So that was just something I was thinking about.
Yeah. No, that's true. I think like if you start thinking about structures and what they do to a garden, I think it's the same thing that they do to a network. And structures take different forms in networks. And it's I really like what you've said there. Yeah. Camille, you wanted to come in as well?
Yeah, I think for me, what's also interesting is the equality piece of this, because there's no one dominant kind of, how do you say, presence as such, like in the garden, like everything is interconnected. So in order to avoid, one sort of like part of it usurping another part, how do you kind of manage that if you equate it to a governance structure, like how do you ensure that equitability across the network? And just something I was thinking about, looking at the graphic, you know, like the different stages of the seedlings, you know, some are growing, you know, more than others. You know, you've got the kind of the embryonic kind of presence, and then you have the more established presence. So how do you manage that as such?
Yeah. That's a really good one. And I like that you picked that from this. Yeah. Yeah, so some of the things that you said really align very well with what I thought, or some of the lessons I also thought about. Some of the lessons I thought sort of relate very well with the garden analogy, around why good soil is the backbone of, you know, of a garden. And if you think about it in the network context, it's so true. Like that's you know, and I would think this perhaps around the backbone, you know, backbone institution, the sort of facilitate and coordinate the network, the core or the central piece of any networked organizations. Having a well-structured, well-aligned, you know, backbone organization sort of helps with the effective facilitation, with effective weaving of the network, with effective relationship management, strengthening, and all that. So that's usually a really key piece of ensuring that the backbone organizations, or people, or the weavers within the backbone organizations, which are the good soil really, is very foundational to a functional network. Prioritization of immediate needs yields results, and again, this sits at the core of what weaving is about, which is around, you know, mapping out who your members are, understanding exactly how they would want to be engaged, how they would want to create meaning within the network, and prioritizing their needs to be able to, you know, strengthen the relationships, ensuring that, you know, you're creating or strengthening whatever connectivity channels you have within the network, to be able to, you know, to be able to be engaged meaningfully. And I don't know if you've had this experiences where in some networked organizations that you have, you know, it's a network organizations of maybe 50 organizations, but just because there's not sufficient prioritization of what members need at that time. For example, they're working on something and they would need connectivity, they would need collaboration on a specific thing at a specific time to collaborate on, right? So if those conditions are not met, you would get people sort of dropping out or losing enthusiasm in the network, or sort of, you know, falling out. And of course, you reap what you sow in networks, and we've seen this all the time. You know, someone ever said, garbage in, garbage out. So what you put in, the effort that you put in to weaving, if you're not putting or setting up enough structures within a network, you're not able to move any pins, right? If your target is, and I mean, that's for impact networks, for example, the target really is to create impact through the network, through collaborative action, through collective action. So if you're not able to sufficiently, or if whatever you put in really is what you get, and this, you know, could revolve around, you know, greed within or duplication of work. So that is what you'll get. You're not able to do much as you would have wanted to do, you know, if you had put in, you know, good stuff. So you get what you reap what you sow. Evaluating the conditions, of course, is very important for any process, like any other process with its projects. Evaluations are important in networked organizations. This is where you take the temperature, understanding what member needs are, what they're working on, how they would want to be engaged, and aligning, which is, again, very key in that process. Constant tending is key, and this is the biggest challenge, I think, in some of the networks, where weaving is some sort of one-off, right? So we sort of sent out a MailChimp, we sent out a newsletter, and that should be sufficient. It could be, but it's not enough to do, you know, to acclimate to the to the potential of a network, right? So constant tending, the conversations, and this ties very well with everything else, with evaluation, with prioritization of member needs. Learning to deal with things outside your control, I think, I think Kathy alluded to this earlier around just being able to understand, what is, being able to understand exactly what you're able to control and what you're not able to, because of the organic nature of the organic nature of networks, right? And I mean, this is really key for any network, because you get to see, because of the many moving parts in network organizations, but also understanding how the dynamics sort of play out each other, and being able to have sufficient skills to be able to navigate uncertainties. And of course, it goes without saying, having patience and trust, because building a successful network, building a meaningful network does not happen overnight. It takes time. And it takes a lot of patience and trusting of the process to be able to, to get the results that you want. So that's basically what I thought would give a context to intentional weaving, which is really weaving with intention, right? And thinking about reaping what you sow. The ability of networks to create systemic change lies in the ability to catalyze, cultivate, and weave deep relationships within networks. And weaving for any network really is important, because it helps networks. I know we've sort of shared this before, but it really helps helps network operate effectively. Again, without it, you will have organizations who have a common purpose coming together, and that's it. There's nothing. They're not working effectively together. They're not collaborating. They don't know. They don't know what's happening, the state of play within the network. So it really helps networks operate effectively. Weaving is an instrument for facilitating change, because I mean, this ties again very well with what we've spoken to earlier around. Change happens when you're conscious about who's in the network and how they can collaborate meaningfully. And of course, connecting people and deepening relationships within networks. So perhaps a quick pause and reflect on what intentional weaving would look like, or what does that look like from where you're sitting. Any thoughts?
Sure, why not? So to me, the intentional weaving is recognizing much of what you presented, right? That this needs tending, and that while people do interact in various ways through affiliations, their job or things they pursue, or cause, if their job is different from their main cause, that doesn't necessarily build a robust network or even a robust community. And to actually create something, and Kamini spoke about this a little bit earlier too, right? To have a structure, to put in place sort of a framework that allows a network to grow, to continue to grow, and also be self-sustaining. Again, it's sort of merging what I would use as a different, network and community, but in either case, it's looking at it and saying there are things that can be done to create this self-perpetuating, structured framework that allows greater, more impact, greater action, more impact, and more connection amongst people.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Kathy. Kamini, please go for it.
I totally sort of agree with what Kathy was saying, but also for me, I think it's that sort of segregation between self-interest and the collective action piece, so that's what I would understand about intentional weaving, the nurturing, cultivating, evolving, kind of approach that lens to as such. And that's where, you know, there is a difference. So if you're going to be part of this kind of nurturing of and strengthening of a network as such, using the analogy, that is where you put your self-interest to not one side, but you know, you capitalize on it and for the greater good, as so to speak.
Right. Yeah. No, that's spot on. Thank you. Thank you. Maria, you have something to share?
Yeah, I think it's I guess it would involve this is again my guess because I don't know too much about this topic, but I think it would kind of involve being aware of, I think, the different strengths and weaknesses of the different parts of the network, and I think maybe trying to ensure that you can kind of use the different individuals or groups and to the best possible capacity, that and so that everyone can like meaningfully contribute to the cause or whatever they're working towards.
Yeah. No, that's. I think you got it. You got it right. Yeah. So I think intentional weaving really does. I really like the point you raised, Mahira and Kathy and Kamini around. You know, you talked about understanding exactly who's there, but also looking at self-interest versus collective action, being very cognizant about that, recognizing that networks need tending. They're very, very useful points. So some of the forms that I thought about, forms of intentional weaving, is really around everything you've said around prioritize. I mean, if we talk about recognizing that networks need tending, as Kathy has said, is around prioritizing, engagement. How do you do that? How do you prioritize engagement with members? And that's really a form of being very intentional about prioritizing engagement with members. That could be in different forms, and of course it takes a lot of listening, a lot of intentional listening to be able to know how members would want to be meaningfully engaged. It's very easy sometimes to sit and think about what people want, but it's also another thing to intentionally listen and create a culture, a listening culture, where you either take, collecting feedback and being very intentional about meaningfully engaging members, right? And for every network, what is very useful for that, for the relationships, for deepening and strengthening relationships, is the creation of a sense of belonging, right? And networks can be we know that networks take different sizes and shapes, right? So for very large networks, it's very easy to get lost inside. It's very easy to get to not be meaningfully engaged, or not to get the connection that you hoped you'd get once you got to the network. But it's another to create an ecosystem where people actually feel like they belong to the network. And this could be in many forms. Again, this could be in communities. I know Kathy spoke about it the last time, about the communities of practice, about there's so many ways of involving members, or rather creating an ecosystem where members feel like they belong within the network. And through that process, you're able to create meaningful relationships that would actually facilitate change, right? And of course, most importantly, is aligning the network's needs, purpose, structures, and processes. Understanding exactly the outfit that is your network, and ensuring that you have all these things sort of aligned to what that is, right? You have a form that speaks to the function of the network. You have structures that actually are easy enough for people to engage. You have processes that are transparent and that inspire trust, that are inclusive, that are equal, and that meets needs of everyone within the network, right? So, or rather, a majority of network members. So, one of the tools, I don't know if we've had time to engage with this. The collaborative toolkit. I know this is a recent resource that was co-developed with Hive. I don't know if it's quite, I was going through it myself, Tamini, and it's just mind-blowing. Just and I sort of stopped and
it's
laughing. Yeah, no, I mean it's
really impressive.
it's brilliant. It's
Yeah.
it's very resourceful, you know. I wonder if, you know, if networks get you know, sort of get around to exploring the different pieces of tools and you know and approaches, I can only imagine what would happen. So of course I intend to explore it further because it's a massive resource, but also, you know, sort of if you have time, it's in the it's in the what do you call it? It's in the Nexus platform. So yeah, under the resources section, but it's I would really urge you to check it out. So as we finalize, one of the questions that I've been thinking, and perhaps I would throw to you to think about, is at what point of the network development process should weaving start, right? When do you start that process? Yeah, based on the conversation today, at what point do you start weaving the network? Yeah, and that's, I think that's it for me.
Very interesting. I mean, I would say from the get-go, basically, because you're because what you know, the way you approach the intentional weaving piece is going to be very indicative of how what the network will look like. You know, we mentioned some of the questions and points around identity and experience, etc. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Thank you, Donita.
Yeah, no, thank you for indulging me. Yeah.